emphasize, because I think what's important to remember also is that a lot of Taiwanese and Hong Kongers are a diaspora Chinese in a way. Because, say, for example, my grandparents, both sides, escaped mainland China because of the Cultural Revolution and because of the Great Leap Forward and all of these sort of internal strife and, frankly, sort of oppressive tendencies of the Chinese regime. And that is the sort of transgenerational trauma that's sort of built into this question, like, do you want to be Chinese? If this is what it represents, the sort of oppression and, starvation and a sort of repudiation of 5,000 years of culture. So yeah, I guess TLDR, who knows? Yeah.
Great. And Rosemary, you were making a distinction before we started recording about the difference between Hong Kongese and Hong Konger.
Mm-hmm.
And could you explain that a little bit more for listeners who may not know the semantics of such a distinction?
So I think what's important to note is that local bilingual Chinese people like me who are from Hong Kong have been calling themselves Hong Kong for a very long time. If you look at South China Morning Post, which is like our premier English newspaper, that's what we call ourselves. We are Hong Kongers. We are the Hong Kong government. It's not Hong Kongese. And so this was, you have to check me on this, but Hong Kongese became the sort of ratified internationally. It was okayed basically by the Oxford Dictionary to basically say, well, if you are from Hong Konger, this is the adjective that you would use. And I think it speaks, right, to like this general sense of a lack of self-determination upon the Hong Kong people. We've been using the term Hong Konger for decades and decades and decades, and I wonder why this sort of standardization of language doesn't take into account Hong Kong English, which is a pidgin but also a language, an English in its own right, and why instead there's this, I think, aesthetically ugly the conglomeration of these, oh yeah, you're Chinese and you're Hong Kongese, right? So again, it's a sense of, so where are the people who are informing the people who write these dictionaries, who look at the standardization and sort of the movements and changes in the English language? Why isn't the Hong Kong view represented?
Hey UC3P listeners, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.
I want to ask you guys about what it's like for young people currently growing up in Taiwan and Hong Kong and their sort of self-determination moving forward. How are they organizing, coordinating, and standing up for themselves and speaking out when it comes to their identity, their politics, and the types of public policy that they would like to see implemented as they go forward?
I can start. I guess I'm gonna start like representing or pretending like I represent like the the average Taiwanese youth, just because they grew up like from a completely different setting from me. I can comment on what I've seen on the news and what a lot of these young activists do. And
sure, that's perfect.
I think the best example of just kind of the youth taking power into their own hand was in 2014. There was the cross-strait trade agreement between China and Taiwan. And that was basically, it was signed by both governments and they were going to ratify it, but the youth took over the parliament and they refused to let the Chinese government sign it. And that was a huge protest. There were a lot of people, and it was comprised primarily of the students, of like young students, high school, university, stuff like that. And mostly because this trade agreement, they felt, would have enlarged China's economic imposition or propensity or possibility of imposition on Taiwan. and they called it like basically like the first step for like the reunification of Taiwan into China. And I think it also reflects very much on why a lot of young people support the Democratic Progressive Party, because they feel like, like for them, they don't identify as from China because they grew up here, they were born here, they grew up here, and they feel like they're Taiwanese. And if they go back to China, they lose a lot of the rights that they have here. And I guess there's a fear of just growing up hearing about all these stories of what it's like being I guess a Chinese citizen rather than the freedom of a Taiwanese citizen. That's kind of like the liberal beacon in Asia. I guess my perspective isn't so much as, I want independence, just because, I don't know, just reading multiple perspectives like on an international sense, and looking at just like the actions that countries take when they feel like, especially strong countries like China and countries that feel like they need to establish regional hegemony because that they can, they definitely use a lot more threatening force than most other countries would, because they have the capacity to. And if I don't know, Taiwan keeps threatening to force independence when China's government clearly presently does not want that. And in fact, there's definitely a lot more like military increases in military preparations, not to say for war, but as like a threat against Taiwan. And Taiwan also has a lot of economic dependence on China. 27% of our exports go to China. 27% of our imports are from China. And there's just this heavy reliance between the two countries that was secured very much so through the consensus, because the Chinese government accepts that. And, I feel like Taiwan, to play its part in the international role and to not, completely throw away its position, it definitely needs to, play by, I feel like, this status quo. And there's no need, I think, necessarily to demand independence, because we have de facto independence. China doesn't have that much influence in terms of just like, policy making, stuff like that on Taiwan. They do have a lot of economic influence. I think that's something that warrants, like, demands attention, and something that the youth in Taiwan definitely pointed to, just in terms of the Chinese investment in the public sector, or not the public, but like the public businesses in Taiwan and etc. There's definitely problems there. But just in terms of keeping Taiwan, on track in terms of in development, I think there shouldn't be like necessarily a threat so much to pull away from this stance that China is currently comfortable with. And and we have the benefit of the international community supporting or preventing China from a takeover militarily. And there's no need to like force a hand, I feel like. But that's my perspective as kind of like a student and was born in Taiwan, and but had my own bubble, I guess, that I grew up in.
Thank you.
Then I guess I'll represent more of the common Taiwanese people. I feel that a lot of us recognize this issue, but most of us do not care anymore, which is kind of sad. But because we all know that Taiwan is de facto by itself, its own country, and although like on websites or on news there are a lot of political debates, but for common people, we're just trying to live through our life. Like, we want to get a job, earn money, raise a happy family. We don't really, not all the people are so politically fervent. Maybe that's only like a few percentage. But for most of the people, we recognize this issue, but it doesn't really come to our daily lives that often. And I also, just for me, I also think that I believe Taiwan should be an independent country. But then at the same time, I know that we have a lot of economical dependence on China. So it's like me, a lot of people also think that what's right is that we should be independent, but at the same time, we also know that we're politically and also economically too weak to be independent. So most of the people, I would say, are just trying to wait and see.
Could I add a little bit more onto that? I guess like part of the concern for like this political debate isn't so much on just like as Kelly said, like just the people in general, but more so like its position or its importance in the identity of the two parties. So Taiwan, like de facto, has two parties that run the country, which is the Kuomintang and the Minjindang. At least from what I've heard, like they have very similar policy stances in many cases. For example, public infrastructure, or need to invest in public infrastructure, and more funding towards social welfare. But because of this identity crisis, the government gets nothing done, and it's been a big issue for a very long time, and people complain about it a lot. and politicians promise, that like they'll get things done this time, but it's always bogged down to this identity crisis. And if the people don't care, but the parties must represent these stances, and they're comprised of primarily like older people, like they put so much emphasis on this, it's kind of halting the changes that's possible in Taiwan, considering that most people want similar things to some extent, and the government just simply isn't getting it done. So that's why I think this issue definitely doesn't need to be on like the forefront of Taiwan politics. There are more important things that need to be dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Alright, just one more thing. I completely agree with what Sean said, because all of them are all tied down to the political debates, such that the economy of Taiwan hasn't really been growing as much as it should have been. Like before, Taiwan was considered one of the 4 Asian tigers, but now I really think if we compare it to Singapore, you can start to see this discrepancy over here that Taiwan has not been growing as much as it should be, and that's because the parties, they keep on debating about what they represent, about our identity, but then they don't really do that much in terms of the economy, which I really hope that they can work on.
So what really started, of course there have been debates about Hong Kong's future from 1997 onwards, obviously, but what really kickstarted the entire sort of thinking about Hong Kong's future was in 2014 after the sort of international Occupy protests. And there's this law professor at the University of Hong Kong named Benny Tai, who basically sort of proposed, along with several other academics whose name I am blanking on, basically were we should, in accordance with this wave of international movements towards democracy and towards self-determination, basically, citing the Arab Spring and everything else, that Hong Kong should be given a chance to determine its own future. So they created this sort of movement or program called Occupy Central with Love and Peace, which is a dumb name, sort of echoing the sort of Occupy protests, and their program was basically doing public referendums. Some background: Hong Kong isn't necessary. It's not a direct democracy in sort of the American sense or in the UK sense. We have a system that depends on what we call functional constituencies. That basically means that some groups of people, such as businessmen, people in different business sectors, have another vote, and other people, the general Hong Kong public, only has one vote, and for if they want to pick the chief executive, which is again showing you how much Hong Kong is deeply intertwined with the global capitalist economy. Anyway, so it was this sort of huge public referendum that was trying to be as sort of as broad as possible and letting the Hong Kong people vote democratically in this way for the very first time outside, and I think this is really important to know, outside of the current political and legal institutions that Hong Kong has that are basically remnants of the British colonial legal system. And so obviously this caused a huge backlash from mainland China because, this idea of Hong Kong being allowed, being independent in this particular way, to be autonomous and to grasp its own political identity and destiny in this particular way, it's very threatening to the Chinese government, because then it's well, what about these other autonomous regions? Think about Tibet, think about the areas closer to borders, where the predominant groups, ethnic minorities, are Uzbeks and other such Uyghurs and other such ethnic minorities who demand self-determination as well. And so there was this concerted sort of effort to discredit the movement, but it went on, and they really tried to have this this entire sort of debate about Hong Kong's future going in LegCo, which is the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, which is basically our Senate. Yeah, our Senate / House. And so, barring that, you have a bunch of people who are actually all in my year. I think what's super interesting is a lot of the sort of student leaders in the Umbrella Revolution of 2014 were led by people who had basically finished their public exams and were you know what, let's go. So you have Joshua Wong, and you have a lot of other people whose names, again, that I'm blanking on, and I would really encourage listeners to go read into this, but basically you have a bunch of 18-year-olds being okay, you know what, this is no longer a tenable position to be in. We cannot just sort of sit there and sort of, handle this entire question of Hong Kong's future with political and legal maneuvers that are perfectly legal. So they